Hello, everyone. I'm here with Nick Leeson. For those of you who don't know Nick, he's a former derivatives trader whose speculative trades resulted in the 1995 collapse of Barings Bank, the oldest bank in the UK at the time, netting a $1.4 billion loss. Nick actually served time in prison for the events that took place at Barings. His story was depicted in the 1998 movie and a book entitled Rogue Trader, which I've read, and I've also watched the movie, and I would highly recommend every trader watches or reads. Nick is here with us today to discuss what happened and what we can learn from his experience about risk and also about self-defeating behavior with regard to trading. Ironically, the folks over at the Trading Battle, knowing that I'm a stickler about risk and that my entire career has been built on putting risk management at the very forefront of my own investment strategy, they felt that it would be great if Nick and I got together and had this discussion about risk. So here we go. Nick, thanks for being here today.
Look, Mark, it's an absolute pleasure to join you today. I'm really looking forward to it.
Awesome. So I'm going to move right into questions here because we only have a certain amount of time, and I have a whole bunch of things that I'd like to cover, a number of issues. Just starting off, first of all, how old were you when you were given such a huge responsibility and such power at Barings Bank? And what exactly was your role that led to the collapse of a 213-year-old institution?
Yeah, well, look, I was 25 years old when I moved to Singapore. So I'd been at that time I'd been working for Barings for a couple of years. Started in London, worked in Japan for a period of time, and then moved on to Indonesia, Hong Kong. Went back to the UK. So I was a bit of an ascending star for a period of time. You know, everything that I did well. I did it very accurately, very diligently, and progressed very quickly through the ranks at Barings. So I started off in some settlement roles back in the UK, and then moved into more of a business development role that eventually led me to Singapore, where it married my experience of futures and options and also with a desire from the bank to activate their seat on the trading floor. And it was trading that always interested me. I mean, I think everybody who works in a bank that's the target, that's where they want to go. And as you know, not everybody gets there, but I think everybody has aspirations. And you know, I joined started to work in the City of London in the Big Bang era back in 1987. So there was lots of opportunity, lots of new big banks moving into the city, and they were looking for people that were eager and hungry like me. So when I first arrived in Singapore, just to answer your question, it was more of a business development role. So setting up the back office, setting up the trading floor. Nobody really knew quite how much business we were going to be bringing to Singapore. It was always a bit of a third or fourth tier exchange. The Singapore International Monetary Exchange only had one or two decent products that it traded that had any real volume in them. So we really didn't have any idea. But then I suppose in setting up the two operations, the one that was of huge interest for me was the trading floor. And that's where I directed my attentions more. And, you know, I think a lot of things combine to make things happen. And one of the things that was occurring at that time, if you go back to those years, sort of 1992 to 1995, the Japanese markets were collapsing. And all of the volume shifted to Singapore, so it became far more prominent, and there was a lot more business and a lot more activity on the trading floor than there'd ever been before.
So let me ask you, how did this catastrophe happen exactly? Did it start out innocently with good intentions, like many of these hedge funds that start off thinking they can trade successfully, but then they suffer losses, and so they try to, cover up while they work things out, and then, by default, it turns into a Ponzi scheme. Were you purposely trying to defraud or accomplish something for your own personal benefit, or was this something that simply spiraled out of control?
Oh, look, it was simply something that spiraled out of control. I mean, my intentions were always good. And as much as I knew that I was doing wrong, pretty much every day throughout the process, the first thing you learn at any time when you're trading is that, the first cut is the best cut. You shouldn't be running positions. And, I knew that was against the remit that I had. So, the first part of my role on the trading floor, it was very much a broker type operation, in that the orders were coming through the squawk boxes from Japan. We were passing the orders to the order fillers on the trading floor. And then after that had finished, I'd go back to the office and make sure all of the settlement functions were okay. So I'd be checking the trades myself, making sure that everything tallied and agreed, because it was an open outcry market. So, 150 people in a very small area using hand signals to trade, and you would always get discrepancies. So I might have thought I traded with you. The person who stood behind you might have thought I traded with him. So there were always things that needed to be sorted out towards the end of the day.
Right.
So I'd look after that.
With regard to discrepancies, the movie Rogue Trader, and of course the book, did these, and I think you said that the book does a better job at depicting the events. Did the movie do a relatively good job of depicting the events? How accurate is the story that's out there in the public? I mean, I love the movie, and I think it's something that, like I said, every trader should watch.
Well, the movie was made by Sir David Frost, so I had absolutely no involvement in it. So it was made from the book. I can only admit to having seen it twice. Once of those was with Sir David when I first returned from Singapore in 1999, and then the second time was with my wife. And it's a really strange one, Mark. The only bits you remember are the bits that are accurate. The things that are a little bit, they're either played down or they're played up. They kind of don't really register in my in my psyche or my memory. So I think it's a fairly good reflection of everything that went on. I think it's definitely simplified, possibly oversimplified, but they obviously wanted to make it viewable for everybody in the public. So I think it's a fairly good chronological explanation of everything that went on through that period. So
one thing that I wanted to ask was, Nick, when I was watching the movie, and I've seen the movie several times, was the oversight at Barings really as lax as the movie depicted? It seems like you didn't really have to try so hard to hide the activity, other than create the famous 5/8 account.
No, I think I mean the lack of oversight was startling, and I think many years ago I talk at events for a living pretty much these days. So after dinners and conferences, and you always get different things that are that are sort of suggested to you. So one of these events many years ago, somebody accused me of organizational arbitrage. Looking for the weaknesses in the system or the weaknesses in the people and trying to take advantage of those. And that really wasn't the case. It was, like I had no idea how I was going to survive from minute to minute, from hour to hour, from day to day. And the oversight that was missing was criminal, effectively. It wasn't criminal back in those sort of days because, there were no sort of laws necessarily specifically against those sorts of lack of oversight. But yeah, look, I was given far too much freedom, far too much autonomy. I think I was an A signatory and a B signatory on the Citibank accounts that we had. So I could have I could have wired any amount of money anywhere that I wanted in the world if that was the, if that's what I wanted to do. The process would have taken one day. I wouldn't have been there for 3 years trying to dig myself out of the hole.
Right. And you went into the bank with a with pretty much a stellar reputation. So, but still being so young, it was a lot of responsibility. That's how I feel. Being so risk adverse personally, I have a hard time wrapping my mind around such an incredible experience from a trading perspective. How do you emotionally handle losing $1.4 billion?
You don't handle it, especially at the time. I think everything is about avoidance. So, you're avoiding the realization of the losses. You're avoiding the realization of your own failure. You're avoiding telling anybody about what's going on. It's a very Jekyll and Hyde type of existence. The reality of what's going on the trading floor, and I'm reasonably clever, right? So I knew that the amount of money that I had from London as additional margin, roughly equated to the loss that I was running at that time. So you can't avoid it, and so I turned to the easiest methods to cope. So I would avoid Singapore whenever I could. I'd go to Indonesia, I'd go to the Philippines, and just try to distance myself from everything that was really happening, the reality of the situation. And you use alcohol as well, which is not, it's one way that you can deal with the stress and you can black out some of the stuff that's happening, but it's not, in no way, shape or form is it an effective coping mechanism, but it's the one I use.
Wikipedia says, and you can correct me if it's wrong, but it says Leeson had followed a doubling strategy. Every time he lost money, he would bet double the amount that was lost in order to recoup the amount. This has been successful for him in the past, including once in 1993, where he was able to cover a $6 million negative balance in the error account. And after that, which he vowed not to use that account again. However, it says Leeson soon found himself hiding his losses there again after he placed a short straddle in the Singapore and Tokyo stock exchanges, essentially betting that the Japanese stock market would not move significantly overnight. However, the Kobe earthquake hit early in the morning on January 17th, Black Swan event, sending Asian markets and Leeson's trading positions into a tailspin. Leeson attempted to recoup his losses by making a series of increasingly risky new trades using a long-term futures arbitrage, this time betting that the Nikkei stock average would make a rapid recovery. However, the recovery failed to materialize.
Yeah, that makes it sound a lot more complex than it actually was, Mark. I have to be honest with you. It's even with the options and like if I can try and simplify it for everybody who's listening, it was just really a case of surviving day by day. So I knew roughly what futures position I had. I'd have statements that would be showing that to me. Was it as clinical as a doubling down every time it went, the position went against me? I don't think so. It was really just a case of how was I there were different hurdles that were going to confront me as I was going down this path. So internal audits, external audits. So those were the key events. And at those particular points, the account balance had to be zero to avoid any scrutiny from anybody, either internally or externally. So, the reason why I used options, and options were introduced, I think, towards the end of 1992 in Singapore. They hadn't had them before then. And they made a classic error when they introduced the options. They paid you 100% of the premium. So this was exactly what I needed. So if I could sell options, I could receive as much premium as I wanted. It would go into the 5/8 account. It would bring the account balance down to zero. And then I would have to pay margin to the exchange. Then I had to convince somebody in London that I needed additional margin to pay to the exchange. So it was throughout the 3-year process, I was swapping a balance sheet item or swapping a P&L item for a balance sheet item.
And of course, those positions, those options, writing those options only works if the stock doesn't move a certain degree against you, correct?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So it was, so people, and again, Wikipedia may do this a little bit. People like to come up with reasons why I made these complex strategies, but it really was a simple one. I needed cash to bring the account balance down to zero. The only way that I could do that was by writing options.
Yeah.
Straddles were the most expensive, so I had to sell fewer of them, and that would bring my account balance down to zero. So it was a cash play.
Right. So I'm glad you said it was, because, it seems like there was some fairly sophisticated techniques that we're talking about here with straddles and so forth. But basically, this debacle was the result of a practice known as, and whether it was, mathematically exactly doubling down or whatever it was averaging down, adding good money after bad. And the reason why I want to talk about this is because I constantly warn about this practice. And I've been through, 40 years, almost 40 years now as a trader. I've been through 8 bear markets and seen many blowups. And I think this type of practice is probably responsible for more blowups than any other practice in trading. With so many stocks now down 50, 60, 70%, I fear that many of the newer, less experienced traders will just keep buying and hoping and then blow themselves up. What did you learn from this experience about respecting risk and averaging down into a falling market?
To avoid it, obviously. But I think the biggest thing, or the biggest lesson over all of those years, was to make sure that I control my risk as much as I can. Make sure that no loss exceeds a certain percentage. I'm always looking at the drawdown on my account. Ideally, I'm keeping it around 8% as a maximum on a daily basis. I day trade still these days. So it's all about controlling the risk. Everybody gets into trading to make money and to be profitable, and look for those perfect entry points and those perfect exit points. They exist, of course they exist, but you're not going to hit them that often. And the key component, and I think you'll probably agree with me here, Mark, is you have to be able to manage risk. You need to understand it, and you need to be able to manage it appropriately. You need to be very disciplined within that, and those are the things that really I've learned. You can, I don't know if it's a 50-50 split or a 60-40 split, but the management of the risk is the key component for me these days.
Yeah. Now, and again, I always say the best thing that can happen to a trader early on is they blow up. Hopefully they do it with a small amount of money that's painful enough for them to learn some lessons, but not so great that they cause irreparable damage. In your case, of course, you were young and you learned at the cost of the bank, and it was a huge lesson in many ways. Of course, going to prison certainly was a severe penalty for that. Now, trading can be very emotional. Okay. And what I'm curious about is, what were your emotions at the time? I know, what happened, but what were the emotions that kept you from cutting your loss and kept you throwing good money after bad? What was the real motivation? It may have started with making money, but was it ultimately to avoid embarrassment, or did you just not want to admit or accept the mistake? At the time, you had a reputation of being sort of a trading genius going into this. So did you let that reputation become something that you ended up trying to protect?
Absolutely. I mean, I think it was a lot of those that you've just mentioned. For me, huge fear of failure, embarrassed by telling people what was going on, and that extended through every sort of avenue of my life. I didn't want to tell my family, my friends. I didn't want to tell people on the trading floor. Didn't want to tell my bosses within the organization either. And that was one of the things that really kept me from really enunciating what was going on and confessing to what was happening. I think another key thing, which I've seen on a couple of your tweets as well, Mark, and I think you touched on it there, is knowing when you're wrong. I think one of the strange things about trading is that, everybody's there to try and make money. So you never think you're wrong. But at what point do you understand that you're wrong and take action? And I think there was one thing that I was reading there today about the 8% rule. And that is one of those levels where I'm sure that you'll say that at that point, if you've run a position to an 8% loss, you're wrong. Now, I still find it difficult today to admit when I'm wrong. And maybe that's the type of personality that I am. Very, very much a type one personality who wants to be in control, doesn't mind making difficult decisions, but you still have to know when you're wrong. You look at my case or Bill Wang or some of the other big cases that exist, they've all gone in too deep. And I think, to give you an example of it from my own situation, as much as it was doubling down or increasing my position, averaging, whatever you want to call it, at some point it just becomes too big. And the element of choice is taken away. It's almost as if you're all in a card game or something, and you keep going in the same direction. And that's because you can't admit when you're wrong. And that's a key. It was interesting reading some of the things that you say, and admitting and knowing when you're wrong
and it's a lot easier to make that admission when it's smaller, right? Like you said,
exactly,
by the time it gets so big, it becomes even harder and harder and harder to make that decision. And then it really becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. I'm glad, you brought up Bill Wang, and I was going to bring up Bill Wang myself. Long-term capital had some of the brightest people in the world running their fund, but they suffered one of the worst debacles in hedge fund history. Bill Wang, who was a prodigy of Julian Robertson, famously known, of course, as a Tiger Cub, blew $20 billion in just 2 days. So my question is, are smart people impervious to risk? And do you think that you could be too smart and run the risk of digging in with a well-formed or rigid opinion, and then the risk actually becomes you?
The risk is very much you, I think, and your type of personality. I think, it comes back to the sooner you act, the better it is in every scenario. And that's just not in the world of finance. That's in everything that you do, health, etc. I think the problem with Bill Wang and with my own, now it was a 2-day scenario for Bill Wang, which I suppose could almost be described as even more psychotic than my own scenario at Barings all of those years ago. But yeah, look, I think it goes back to that thing about, knowing when you're wrong. And I think sometimes for certain personalities, and it's not everybody, you need something which is going to trigger that realization that you are wrong. So, in the example that I read of your own scenario, the 8% level, that is triggering when you are wrong. And it's taking the decision away from you, because you're very disciplined, you're very risk averse, and you understand what you're doing. You've learned from your mistakes, but that's triggering a definite hard line.
Yeah, hard line in the sand, and that's my maximum. That's not even
exactly
my maximum loss.
Yeah.
Whereas I think. Yeah, let me ask you. Some people feel, sorry to interrupt, but I got so many questions I want to get through. And one thing I have to say, I'm very impressed with you about is that, number one, you're very honest, you're very candid, and you're taking complete responsibility. I love you learned a lot from this, so that's wonderful. What a lot of people feel, the markets have changed, and also, a lot of people like to post blame, to put blame. In 1987, they blamed the crash on program trading. In the 1990s, it was the So's bandits. Then it was high frequency trading. Then, or now it's the algos, and who knows what it'll be next. But you suffered the same fate without some program going wild or some discrepancy in the system. Discrepancy was actually you at taking advantage of a discrepancy in the system, as you alluded to. The discrepancy was probably ego to some extent. Did it the old-fashioned way, by hand? What does that say to the average trader about risk being present, regardless of technology? Can a trader still blow up his account with such practices?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think as soon as you go down that route of averaging or of doubling down or anything of that ilk, of course you can blow up your account and you can blow it up quicker. I mean, in the modern day, when you look at Robinhood and Wall Street bets and CFD and spread betting, there's so many people who are getting involved without that understanding. And the focus is very much on, and it's almost laser-like focus on making money. And they want to make money quick. They want instant gratification. Nothing you do in the financial markets is instant. You have to do the hard work around the risk and understand that. But yeah, look, people are blowing up their accounts every day, unfortunately. But if they understood a little bit more about risk and were disciplined around that process, they would be in a far better position.
I've had so many traders, and mostly newer traders, which I can tell by their comments. And I hear this every cycle. It's different this time. It's different this time. Things have changed. You don't understand. But we know human emotions never change. And with regard to trading and risk management, I mean, do you really think anything's really changed dramatically over the years, or do we still need mechanisms and policies in place to manage and mitigate risk?
You definitely need policies and processes in place to mitigate risk, and you need to understand and define that point. You called it the hard line in the sand. Don't offer too much risk to the market. The markets are very, very efficient. Things might get out of line, for short periods of time. And, there were always days sometimes where the market would turn slightly in my favor, and you get this confidence, not necessarily that you're beating the market. There's a little bit of ego in that, but you've got more chance to try and turn it around. And I'm sure Bill Wang's felt that, and, Jerome Kerviel and everybody else who's been in one of these situations over a number of years has felt that. So you're always looking for the smallest positive to suggest that you've got a chance. But
certainly
if you don't have that effective risk management, I think unfortunately, I think that eventually you will blow up.
I like the term that you used. You said, don't offer the market too much risk. Don't offer too much risk to the market. You said, don't offer too much risk to the market. I love that. And that's exactly how the philosophy I live by is. I don't want to offer the market too much risk. I want to cut off that risk, and I want to create asymmetric volatility where my risk is very low, but my upside is very high, and keep that sort of lopsided distribution curve, if you will. Speaking of this, what do you think of Cathie Wood? She's been doubling, tripling, and quadrupling down on many of her investments gone wrong. Do you think that she runs the risk of having a Barings type debacle? I mean, she's already suffered a 70% drawdown, so I guess the debacle is already in progress.
Yeah.
Any feelings or opinions on the ARC strategy or partial strategy that may lack a risk management component?
Look, it's exactly the same thing. She has to admit that she's wrong at some point. And I think, it's very difficult for me when one of the things that I often get asked, and I find it very, very difficult to answer, is at what point did you know that this was going down, that you were in too deep and you couldn't get yourself back out of the situation? And it's really difficult to define. So you get, whether you call it doubling down or averaging, the position's getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And then I think at some point you pass the point of no return. Your position is so big and Kathy Woods maybe reached this at some point, that you almost have to continue going in the same direction. I'm sure it happened to Bill Wang over that 2-day period when he continued to do things in the same direction. And it goes back to all of those things that we've spoke about already. It's about knowing that you're wrong or admitting that you're wrong and getting to that point early. Because the earlier you get there, the better it's going to be. Whereas if you continue to increase your position, you know this yourself, the market is efficient. It will find you out eventually. And there are also lots of people in the market, when they know what your positions are, they're going to work against you and they're going to try and squeeze you out of it as well. So unless you have an abundance of capital to be able to throw at that, eventually it does run out. It did with Barings. They continued to send me money as margin that was fed to the exchange, and that allowed me to continue going in the belief that one day, I might be able to turn it around. Unfortunately, at some point, I think for me, it was the end of 1994, just before the collapse of the bank, that I knew there was no way back. But
they say that the market can outlast your liquidity, and that's really, basically what you reach the end of the line at some point.
Yeah.
And that's where you experienced, of course. But and I agree with, to a certain extent. I know Kathy has gotten big, and it's much tougher, to manage risk on a larger amount of money, especially when you're talking in the billions. However, letting a stock drop 80%, there's certainly many opportunities to sell along the way. And I think if you look back, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but if you look back, you probably could have, even though it was so big and it was so much money, you certainly could have made some different decisions and mitigated risk. Maybe not eliminated it, but certainly mitigated it and not blown up.
Yeah, no, look, I agree entirely. I think the one caveat that I would put on that is that you have to look at the marketplace and what the marketplace can facilitate. So, and I'll give you a very quick example. I was probably short something like 60,000 options towards the end of the collapse of Barings, but the market makers in the pit were all quite small. So there was CRT from Chicago, Spear Leeds, Kellogg, I think FEMAT or Societe Generale were in there, but the size that they could offer was very, very small. It was 20, maybe 50 lots. I was short 60,000 options. So I went past the point that I was able to find the liquidity to be able to get out of those positions. So it really was, at that point, you were waiting for a eureka moment.
You certainly weren't getting out in the click of a mouse like you do today.
No, no, and I don't think Kathy would either. I mean,
that's right.
Back in the day, back in Barings in Singapore, you would get the market makers meeting in Tokyo, because I was short volatility effectively. They were all long volatility, and it was hurting them. And they would meet in Tokyo at the weekends, and they would try to push volatility up. So there would be a bit of a cabal, if you like, who would try to increase the bid price to try and push the volatility a little bit higher. But that if I stepped into the options pit, and even if they priced the market, if fair value was 15, they made it 15 bid at 20, and I bought the 20s, they would immediately go 20 bid at 25. And it was just, at some point, it becomes impossible, because other people are going to get in front of you. That if I was selling at 5, you'd sell at 4, I'd come in at 3, you'd probably sell at 2. And eventually, it's a self-defeating prophecy. And I think the unfortunate part of that, and I don't know, I wouldn't have the exact details on Kathy Wood's positions, but I think she's approaching that sort of scenario. Can she turn around and unwind that position now, or has she gone too far?
Yeah, and of course, position sizing versus the trading volume is the way to offset that. Like, I'm only going to take a position size, a certain fraction of the trading volume. So I'm always knowing that I can get out. There's going to be that liquidity. And what you're saying is that you went beyond that liquidity. You went far beyond that liquidity. And then again, though, but if Kathy's going beyond that liquidity, or if any manager is going beyond that liquidity, well, now it becomes that, they're basically managing money, knowing that they're putting their investors at risk, and they got to stop taking money. It can't just put the money first. They've got to put the risk. They've got to put the clients first. And if you're taking so much money where now you don't have the liquidity for your strategy, well, you don't have your strategy anymore. So the answer is to stop taking in assets and maybe open another fund or have another strategy. But that's a whole nother conversation. Going just a little bit deeper, and then we're going to wrap this up pretty soon here, but just going a little bit deeper here, for your own personal experience, have you ever acknowledged an underlying pathology in not only your behavior, but your thinking? Because I believe these type of events stem from a psychological malfunction that then leads to a trading malfunction. You did, in fact, go through an increasing number of maneuvers to hide these losses. So how did you address your mindset behind the behavior, and what did it take for you to change that thinking? Because you're now using stop losses. You're, probably positioning sizing accordingly. You've basically completely turned around, and now with your own money, at least, with a complete opposite approach. How did you change that thinking? Because the thinking's got to change before the behavior changes.
Yeah, I think a lot of that occurred whilst I was in prison in Singapore. You have a lot of time on your hands, so you can really pull down the veneer of yourself and everything that happened, and you have to acknowledge certain personality traits. So, I do believe that I'm right most of the time, and you have to start to counteract that. I do. I was always. Trading on a desk, the way that I was trading in Singapore, stop losses, it's a very manual environment. So stop losses didn't really exist as they do today. You know where they are, but you've got to trigger them manually. You're in a pit and you're trading, you're holding your cards, and you know what position you have. The stop has to be triggered manually. There were no screens back in those days, and you understand the importance of stop loss, and you have to incorporate those in everything that you're doing. I think the drawdown is key as well. But you really took a long, hard look at yourself whilst I was in Singapore, and started to understand. And it's your own behavior, it's your own personality traits. And they exist on a continuum, and there's a good end and there's a bad end, and you have to work out which is which and where you sit within that. And I think you fluctuate along that over the period, but I'm still very impulsive. I still want to click that button more often than I do, and you kind of have to pull yourself back from it. And I read a book many years ago by a gentleman called John Coates, who's he used to be a floor trader. He went on to be a neuroscientist. He's a fellow at Cambridge University, but it's called The Hour Between Dog and Wolf. And it kind of it explains all the psychological processes you go through when you're trading, you have a position on, and some of the emotional processes that happen to you within that, and understanding some of those. And you spoke earlier, I think, about emotion and controlling emotion. And, I was a very emotional person. I think I'm less emotional now than I was after all of my experiences. But it is easy to get caught up in what's going on in the market. We've had Fed Day today, and the market's pinging around all over the place, and I'm sure causing people lots of difficulty. And you've got to have an avenue to use, or to work against some of that emotion. So, I do simple things. I try to exercise as much as I can, and get away from the screens. I'm not somebody who wants to sit in front of a screen for 8 hours a day. The less screen time, the better for me.
Nick, I want to thank you very much for being here with us today. You've been very candid. The good news is you learned lessons, and because of that, we're learning lessons. That's what it's all about, passing the torch and learning from mistakes. It's been very interesting and educational. I'm sure we can go on and on and on. I wish you the very best, and cheers, my friend.
It's a pleasure, Mark. Thank you very much.